So thank you very much, and I think we can take a huge amount from Bob's really, well, fun, I should say, joyful and thought-provoking session. And Bob, I now understand why I couldn't get maths. Thank you very much. All this stuff, none of this stuff. So that was a real revelation to me. Thank you. It's my real pleasure to welcome you all to this session, Physical or Digital Future Learning Spaces. I think it's a really important time to be reflecting on the relationship between the learning space and the learning. It's an area which I think is largely underdeveloped. I don't think we have enough clear research or evidence about the relationship. What I do know from the work that I've been doing on governance at Advanced HE over the years is that governing bodies, and they do say, and I couldn't say personally, vice chancellors are obsessed with buildings. I do think it's more than just the building. I think there has been an increasing commitment and curiosity and imperative to really think about how we design our new learning spaces. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce the panel to you here today. I have Frank Cotton here on my far left, Vice Principal for Learning and Teaching at this very university. Next to Frank is Professor Sian Bayne, Professor of Digital Education and Assistant Principal at University of Edinburgh. With a title like that, we've got great expectations, Sian. And then to my right here, I have Han, who is Han van Krieken, Rector Magnificus. I'd love a title like that, wouldn't you, Rector Magnificus? From Radboud University. And last but not least is Dr. Herckis, the Simon Initiative Research Scientist at Carnegie Mellon University. They're going to talk to us, Frank is going to talk to us about, well, I'm not going to tell you really, but there's a question which he said to me last night: how many students can we get in this room? And I'll leave him to explain what that means to him. Lauren's going to talk to us about her research in relation to technology and the human interface. Sian's going to talk to us about old buildings and the challenges of old buildings and the heritage buildings. And then I think, Han, you're going to do a bit of future gazing for us, aren't you? We know we need to be flexible. We want interdisciplinarity, but it's very difficult to predict where we're going to go. So without further ado, the way we're going to run this, our speakers are going to speak for about 6 to 7 minutes to stimulate your thinking, do some provocation around this agenda, and then we really want to open up for comment and debate and engagement with the audience. So if I may ask Sian to start us off, please.
Are my slides all ready to go?
I imagine that they are, okay. Sian.
Thank you. Thank you for putting me first, I think. So one of the questions that we were posed as a panel was institutions that have historical and old buildings to work with, are they at a disadvantage when thinking about future learning spaces? To which I want to say absolutely not. No, it's a massive advantage. I'm going to talk about a building that we have at the University of Edinburgh, which is a historical building. And in thinking about this, the future of this building as a learning space, it gives us an opportunity to think, what does it actually look like to design an ambitious new learning space which takes account of the kind of symbolic imaginaries of a really interesting past, and enables us to link the teaching that we do within that building to the values of the academic and civic community that surround that building. So the building I'm talking about, and I only have 7 minutes, I'd love to show you way more slides. The building I'm talking about is the old Royal Infirmary building in the middle of Edinburgh. So this building was opened as a hospital in 1879 and functioned as a hospital until 2001, at which point it was bought, and the University of Edinburgh bought it in 2015. The idea being that we will make this building into a new interdisciplinary quarter for the University of Edinburgh. So at the moment it looks like this. It's a real building, it's a total building site, lots of rot was found, it's all being scraped out now while we get our thinking together about what kind of future learning space we want this to look like. By the time it opens in 2021-22, it will look something like this: 21,000 square meters of new learning space, a new public plaza at the front, event spaces. The overarching vision for this space is that it's an interdisciplinary institute. It's dedicated to human flourishing and sustainable futures in a data society. So data for the social good is very much in there. And it's about transdisciplinarity. It's about making connections through research, but also through the kind of education and teaching that we do in this space. We want to design new kinds of education that are challenge-based, looking at global challenges, flexible, hybrid, and lifelong. This building was a design, the wards were inspired by the work of Florence Nightingale, so they're called Nightingale wards, and they're designed to jut right out into open green space so that light and air can circulate freely through these wards as a means of infection control. And what we want to make of this in teaching and learning terms is a kind of learning space which is defined by flow, by encounter, unexpected encounter, co-production, connection. These are the kind of themes that we're going to be addressing through this space. So they're the kinds of themes that we've been talking about a lot today, which are about the global, critical citizens who are able to think about and approach as a life mission, almost the kind of the themes and challenges that we are facing as a global society around the future of economy and capitalism, creativity, health, and so on. But with data, creativity, criticality, and inquiry moving through all of those. When we kind of called this new space the Edinburgh Futures Institute, we realised that we were asking quite a difficult question around whose future are we talking about, because we have to remember this building has a long pedagogical history already. The image that you can see here is of nursing education within that building in the 1950s and 60s. So we need to think about who is this future for? Is it for the staff of the university, for the students? Yes, but also for the local community and future students. Many of the members of our academic community were actually born in this building. Certainly many members of the local community were born in this hospital. And the hospital is kind of branded very strongly with this patet omnibus, open to all. So when there was a kind of big industrial action earlier this year, teachers were on strike in universities across the country. At that point, some of our students occupied a building in the central area of our university, and they claimed for themselves the name of the Edinburgh Futures Institute, saying, actually, it's our institute is actually open to yours. Yours is a kind of closed-off space. You know, we assert our right to define what the future of learning spaces should look like, and that was a really I think that was a good thing for the whole university to hear at that point, particularly in thinking about the future of this learning space. So before I finish, because I'm aware I don't have much time, I wanted to just flag this idea that how we design our future learning spaces needs to be based fundamentally in the values of the academic community and local community that inhabit this space. So at the moment I'm leading a project called Near Future Teaching, which is about co-designing the future of digital education specifically in partnership with university students and staff. And what we're doing through this project, it will finish around the end of this year, is to surface the shared and collective values that our academic community holds around what teaching should be like, what it should constitute, and by extension, what kind of future learning spaces we will need. And these are the values. After kind of conversations with 200-300 students and staff, we've been whittling them down. These are the core values that we have surfaced to date. They're around putting the experience of being a student, of having time to think and learn over the kind of rigid, instrumentalized, over-assessed curricula that we often kind of find ourselves part of. Diversity, inclusion should be at the heart of what we do. So, social participation, transparency, co-production of curricula with students. And finally, relationships over instructions. Definitely a move away from didacticism to thinking about relationships, academic community, and putting those at the heart of what we do. This is my last slide, and it's one of my favourite ones. It's a photograph from the inside of the clock tower of the old infirmary building, and that little kind of almost humanoid figure is the mechanism that drives the clock. And for me, there's something about this image, which is a highly mechanised, technologised, robotic kind of figure looking out through the back of time, I think tells us something about how we need to think about future learning space in temporal terms, as well as pedagogic. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely wonderful. I think it's marvellous to see, you know, how you're transforming that building, and you're building in the values that you talked about in co-creation. And I'd be very interested to. I'm going to invite Lauren to reflect from your perspective of technology, human interface. What are your reflections on what you've just heard and seen there?
Well, I think it's wonderful. I think that the consideration for what we can take from what is already in place, heritage buildings, and the goals and values of the faculty, staff, and students really must inform our plans moving forward in each context.
And do you think that approach would advance sort of the use of technology to support learning?
Well, certainly, if you don't incorporate the perspectives and needs of the infrastructure that's in place and the folks who will be involved in the creation and use of those spaces and structures, then they won't go anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Well, this actually leads us nicely into what Frank's going to talk to us about. So, Frank.
Thank you. So this is a question that Alison mentioned earlier on. How many students can you fit in a lecture room? And the reason I wanted to start with this question is twofold, really. First of all, when I came into this role, it was one of the most common questions I get asked. And it was about how many seats could you squeeze in to one of these lecture theatres that Bob talked about that have got the seats bolted to the floor. And the object of the exercise was to squeeze as many seats as you possibly could into the space. And for me, that is fundamentally the wrong question. There are elements of the question, there are two elements of the question that are wrong. The first one is, how many students can you squeeze into a room? You shouldn't be thinking about that. You should be thinking about how students are going to learn in that room. But the second thing that's wrong for me is the word lecture. The assumption is that it's a classic one-size-fits-all model, that all of the teaching that we do will be lectures. And actually, there are other reasons why this doesn't make a lot of sense. So the diagram there is actually taken from the University of Durham website. And I don't know if this is still on the website, but it was when I took this. And this shows teaching room utilization in the institution over a period of 7 years. And the way that you get room utilization figures is you multiply the percentage of time used, in other words, the percentage of time during the week that people are in the room, by the percentage occupancy. And you get utilization. And you can see there that it's peaking at about 25%. And that's not uncommon. Most universities are sitting somewhere in the 20s, usually towards the high 20% for overall utilization. Usually the frequency number is high, so the room is in use a lot of the time. It's not full a lot of the time. And then, of course, if you look at the temporal issues over a semester, a recent study at ANU, the Australian National University, looked at this, and this is not atypical, but probably in their case slightly more extreme. They found that by week 2, attendance at lectures had dropped to 30%. That's by week 2 of the semester. So in essence, what we are doing in week 1, if we were to teach in a phone box, is that we're packing a room as full as we possibly can, and then by a few weeks later, you've got a lot of space left in your lecture room. But therein lies a problem, because your lecture room actually isn't a very useful room for students to learn in. There is a move within the sector towards more and more active learning. And that's been driven by a number of factors. And actually, it's been driven by underpinning research into how students learn. The need to muddle, as Bob said. But I just want to return to the lecture for a second. Why are students choosing not to attend lectures? You will read lots about this in the literature. You'll hear about its digital resources that are now available. So you can get lecture materials, you can get notes, etc., all online, so there's no need to come into the room. But actually, you also have a generation who are attaching a value to their time. We heard Lauren speak this morning about the fact that students outside of their university scheduled time are working. Their time is valuable. And if there is no value in coming into that room, they ain't going to do it. They're not going to come into the room. So if all that the faculty member is doing is simply reading from a set of PowerPoint slides, then the students may as well not be there. But unfortunately, across higher education, That is the predominant model. It's a predominant model of teaching in higher education. And when our lecture rooms are full, they look a bit like the top picture there. That's one of the lecture rooms in the University of Glasgow, and I have to say, that was posed for a publicity slide. And the reason I'm highlighting that is I don't want you to get the impression that University of Glasgow students are any more attentive than any other students. Had this been taken in a normal scenario, the room would not be quite as densely packed as it is, and I'm sure some of them would not be paying as much attention as they are here. The problem with this room, though, is that if you want to engage students in active learning or any other form of teaching other than lecture, you can't really do it. That room is built for transmission and transmission only. And we've found clever ways of trying to get around that. We've got in-class voting systems, we can use peer instruction, but the reality is that the opportunity for students to interact with each other and the faculty member are extremely limited. You can probably talk to the person on one side, you can probably talk to the person on the other, but once you start to think about the people behind and in front, the slope of the floor can actually mitigate against that. So your opportunity for interaction is poor. So we decided, if there is no benefit in adding seats into a lecture room in terms of utilization, and there's not, because remember that earlier diagram, actually you put more seats in, your utilization goes down. What we decided to do was take seats out. This is despite the fact that our student population was increasing. And we just got a bit better at fitting classes into rooms, and we just got a bit better at timetabling to offset that. And this was the first room that we changed. We took a very conventional lecture theatre and we simply put some group tables into that space. It didn't stop colleagues lecturing in the space, but it created the opportunity for much more engagement and active learning in the space. And the faculty member who teaches in that room can reach any student in the room. So it's no longer the case that the student in the middle is isolated. The faculty member can get anywhere there. So we started that a few years ago, and we've continued to do that. And over the last few years, we've been converting more and more rooms in this university into active learning spaces. And there's a range of spaces shown there. And we've been supporting our academic colleagues to evolve their approach to teaching. We've been exposing them to the literature, we've been giving them the opportunity and support to develop the way they teach. But actually, when they walk into rooms like this, they think, oh, I could do something different here. And they start to think about doing that themselves. As of next year, on this campus, we will have achieved a critical mass of these types of rooms because our new learning and teaching hub will be opening. And our new learning and teaching hub is full of spaces for active learning and for collaboration. This is the main auditorium, and if you haven't gone down to see the VR bubble downstairs, you can actually walk into this room in the VR bubble. It looks like a lecture room. It isn't a lecture room because every 2 rows are on the same tier. And the front table, so for the front row of students, the front table is a standard writing table. The back table is a full-width collaboration table. We can have 500 students in this room working in groups of any size and collaborating with each other. And what isn't shown in this image is that all around the room there are screens so that no matter which direction you're facing, you can see information that's being displayed in this room. Over the next few years, we will be converting more and more of our estate into active learning space, and by reaching critical mass, we get to the point where we can actually deliver the majority of our teaching through that methodology. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frank. So Han, Frank's encouraged us to think not so much about how many students we get in the room, but how are they going to learn? And I think you're going to be sharing with us your perspectives, thinking about what we need to be thinking about in future. I wonder if you could comment in terms of what it is they need to learn from your perspective, and reflecting on what's happening here at Glasgow.
Well, I think this is an excellent example of what's happening here in Glasgow, how you create a different environment and the behavior changes immediately without any teaching like the Angry Birds. You don't have to have a long list of what you do in the room. It happens already there. It's a very nice example. And actually, the most recent building we opened, we didn't have a large lecture room. We only had a theater room. So it can also be used for music and students who want to have plays in the evening or whatever. And the few large lectures we still have were transported to a cinema, actually. The idea was good, but not great, because we didn't realize that if you put young students in comfortable chairs in a semi-dark room, is maybe not the best way to have a big lecture. But the other experience we have, several of the rooms in this new building have only chairs that are not bolted, but have wheels and small desks. So if you come in the room, it looks very strange. So the students and the teacher have to assemble themselves in the room. And at first we thought this may be a bit difficult, we'll see what happens. But these are now so overbooked, every teacher wants to use that room. So I think your examples are great for changing the way you teach.
Thank you very much. Lauren, would you like to take the stage and tell us about your research? Thank you.
So I don't have slides, in part because I'm not talking about specific kinds of innovations, but rather the challenges of using them effectively. So I'll start by saying that Carnegie Mellon has a world-leading research program in learning sciences and is a center for cutting-edge innovation and creativity when it comes to educational technologies. We have a center for teaching and learning that's world-renowned. And I say all of this to give you context for the fact that a few years ago, we started having conversations on campus about why, if we know so much about how learning works and how to teach effectively, and we have such incredible tools and technologies at our disposal, and some of the faculty on campus know more than anyone in the world about teaching effectively and about how learning works and about the educational technologies that they've developed, why haven't we seen sweeping change and widespread adoption of these tools and practices on our campus? So we spent a few years doing some research. I'm a Simon Initiative researcher, which is named for, well, so the Simon Initiative was named for Herb Simon, who was a Nobel and Turing laureate, famous, among other things, for his exploration of learning. The Simon Initiative at Carnegie Mellon works to integrate research on teaching and learning with the practice of teaching on campus. So I spent a couple of years, I have spent almost 3 years now, doing mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative research on the kinds of transformations that take place, or the kinds of transformations that we attempt to achieve, and the barriers to achieving those transformations, the affordances that support them. So I'm an anthropologist by training. I'm really interested in people and organizations and the kinds of structures that support change and the kinds of change that people are open to, the kinds of change that are seen as counterproductive or frightening. So take a university like Carnegie Mellon. We have a long history, not as long as some histories, but we have some heritage buildings that have been in place for a while. We have faculty who amongst them have, I'm not sure whether I can say, probably centuries, it's about right, of experience teaching, and a lot of expertise. We have policies in place and practices in place on campus that shape the constraints that allow faculty to teach in certain ways or make it challenging for them to take time or to put effort towards or to access resources related to teaching. And the faculty changes. Every year, there are new faculty. There are some faculty who have been there a very long time. There are some who are just starting out. Every year, research in disciplinary contexts changes. So faculty update their courses, perhaps. to some degree or another based on changes in their field. The institutional infrastructure changes. There are new capacities in terms of tools and technologies available, new constraints, new institutional foci, departmental changes. So the context changes as well. So over the course of a couple of years of research, I followed 4 different projects. These were all really varied, but they were all aimed at developing new tools or technologies or integrating effective teaching practices on campus. So I collaborated with a number of colleagues on these projects, and over the course of 4 years, I sat in on meetings, I was copied on email chains, I interviewed faculty and staff and students, and tried to understand how these efforts unfolded. At the end of 4 years, at the end of 2 years of observation and analysis, I was giving a talk with a collaborator who's a dean in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and someone asked, so those 4 projects that you followed, how many were successful? How many actually took that plan to create a statistics module that could be used across campus, or an opportunity to develop a writing tool that would be useful across classes? How many of those projects worked? And I said, well, it depends on what you mean by worked, because in some of the cases the goals changed and people decided that there was a different target that made more sense, and in some of the projects the collaboration kind of fell apart, and so there's one person who's still working on it, but everybody else and the dean interrupted me and said, they all failed. So your definition of success really matters. The question is, how do we take the institutions that we have and bring them into a context where we can say, these things that we know about teaching, these things that we know about learning, are being practiced effectively on our campus? How do we transform our campuses, creating the opportunity to teach in innovative ways, or to teach in ways that go beyond the lecture is an important step. The creation of infrastructure and opportunity is necessary, but it's not sufficient. How do you create the culture change? How do you bring faculty into that process? So, among many other things, here are some of the findings from our research. First of all, it matters who. Matters who we're talking about. We've heard a lot today about what faculty are good at, what faculty like, what faculty resist, what motivates faculty, and the truth of the matter is that faculty are diverse. Faculty are products of their professional development, of their disciplinary training, and of their own experiences. Faculty are motivated by different things. So faculty approach teaching in a variety of ways. We can identify different ways that faculty approach teaching, but if we approach faculty about changing their teaching or about incorporating new practices in the same way across the board, we'll have some folks who buy in, who are excited to learn about how students learn, or who are inspired by a new classroom that can be used in novel ways. And there'll be other faculty who are much less inspired, much less engaged, and who we have to work with differently in order to bring them into a new practice. It matters when. We've heard a little bit about faculty professional development and willingness to engage in professional development opportunities, the value of future faculty training. One of the things that we found is that faculty at Carnegie Mellon change their classes every semester. Great, right? They're supposed to be updating their courses. Every year since their degree, they are about 4% less likely to make changes to to components of courses that they teach semester to semester. So they continue to innovate, they continue to make changes, and they are less likely as time goes on. I think someone used the word calcify earlier today, but 4% less likely from semester to semester, or year to year, I'm sorry. They are 49% less likely with each year to incorporate technologies that they haven't used before in that class. So the kinds of changes that we're asking people to make, the kinds of lifts that we ask them to undertake in order to incorporate new tools and practices depend a lot on what we're asking them to do. And finally, it matters where. We heard a little bit earlier today as well about alignment of institutional mission with the kinds of rewards, the kinds of space that faculty are given to develop their innovative practices and to make the kinds of transformations that we hope to achieve. Having a mission statement that says, we value teaching excellence is insufficient if the faculty don't have the resources or the time that they need in order to do the work, in order to improve teaching. And finally, we learned that we can change what we see on campus with rigorous, continuous research and experimentation. We can do research on this process itself. As we try new things, as we experiment with new things, we can pay attention to what happens and promote the things that work well and make changes when we don't. And this is around improving teaching on campus, integrating research-based practices and understanding well what works well in order to promote those practices in the future. So with that, I'll leave it to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Sian, seeing that you're kind of a digital expert, an education expert as well, Lauren started off by saying, why haven't we seen sweeping change? And then you began to answer your question. I just wondered how much of what she said chimed with what you find and what you're trying to tackle in Edinburgh, but also other experience.
Yeah, I thought you were bang on in the conclusions that you were drawing there, because I think particularly in the field of digital education, we tend to see change to teaching as being a question of technological implementation, and actually the cultural implementation is way more complex and way harder, and I think that's what your research was surfacing. And cultural implementation is more than just kind of staff training. It's actually about a shift of mindset and a move away from seeing technology as kind of having an instrumental relationship with technology to seeing it as part of our environment and the air that we breathe and how we operate. So I thought that was really great. And I also think that having an ethnographer on the case is fantastic, and I think all universities should have an ethnographer of this kind of change, because I think as a research method, it's just such a brilliant way to surface really rich, in-depth insight into managing change in teaching. So thank you.
Thank you. Han, right, take us and to look into the future, how we can be more flexible, more interdisciplinary, and help us to predict where we need to go. Thank you.
Well, actually I'm here rather with a problem than an answer, but from Robert Duke I heard and we experienced that that's actually the better learning experience. So you need to try to solve this problem the next couple of hours. But in contrast to Bob's problem, this one I'm not sure it's solvable, and I like to discuss with you answers over drinks. So it's a bit different. About 10 years ago, there was a large survey in the Netherlands on how campuses would look like in the near future. And the answer everybody gave was they will be smaller, fewer students, because there will be online cloud learning. The opposite has happened, at least in the Netherlands. Maybe the time frame is too short, 10 years. The Deakin experience is not settled. Maybe in the near future it will change. On the other hand, I'm quite doubtful of that. However, you may all know the famous quotation of Niels Bohr saying prediction is difficult, especially when it's about the future. Actually, that was a quote from Lao Tse 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years ago. So we don't know where it's going, so that's an issue. Now the question of this session is physical or digital? Well, the easy answer is replace or with and you have already part of the solution, physical and digital, but that's of course not the complete answer. So if we think about new buildings or renovating buildings, we have to think about that. We are thinking at least of 20 years ahead, because these buildings have to last that long, otherwise our investments are not okay. And then we have to think about teaching areas, research areas, laboratories, not that easy. I have experienced myself, I had to make a new building for my laboratory of pathology. I'm a pathologist by training. We had a lot of laboratories in there, wet laboratories as we call them. But then the genetic revolution came, and in 5 years we had to change wet laboratories into computer rooms. So it's very hard to predict the future. Now, there are a few developments we see now that are important to all of us, and they have to do with connection. Connection between disciplines, connections between different types, different levels of training. We know that our academics have to work with persons coming from other type of colleges, applied sciences, vocational training, but we separate the teaching. That's not good. We know that's not good. I had a nice example where our medical school were very proud that they offered a course on communication with patients together for doctors and specialized nurses. And I said, wow, that's okay, but how about the not so specialized nurses? And they said, well, they don't have the level that they can take this type of communication course. And we all know in real practice they have to do the same work. So we have to change minds there. So connection between different types of levels, different types of research approaches, that's difficult because the other part of it, Homo sapiens is a very social species. We need to do things together. We have to come together. That's why we have coffee machines for new ideas. And many of us have better coffee machines, actually with beans in it, so it takes longer before the coffee comes out. So there's more time for this interaction, so that I'm not sure if it's done on purpose to get better interaction, but it's happening. But these coffee machines are still in buildings where we have one faculty, at least in most universities in the Netherlands and also abroad. We have the faculty of science, we have the faculty of arts, and we want to have them work together. But the coffee machines, if the coffee is not better in the science building, you still keep your coffee in your own building. The only solution we had, the best coffee is in the administrative building, so sometimes they come to me just for the coffee. Now, how do we bring these different people together? That's not easy. Students want to study together, they want to go to places. We get complaints that sometimes the building is too full, and actually the student council proposed to ban high school students from our campus because they took up space, and we like to have high school students on our campus. But when the building of science was too full, actually the medical school had plenty of space, and we could even show that to students. But to go to a place where they could study, even study alone, in a different building was a way too high hurdle. Now this is my problem. Some solutions we try to explore, which is offer interfacultary, interdisciplinary courses, and not in the way that you have, so for instance, we had a course on happiness, one lecture from a philosopher, one lecture from a social scientist, one lecture from a biologist, and they even didn't meet one another. So that's not a solution at all. But offering interfacultary, interdisciplinary courses where teachers come together and learn from one another, and students come together and learn from one another, is one start of a solution. But nevertheless, I'm still puzzled how I have to build my next building to give some answers to this problem. So I hope for your answers.
Thank you very much, Han. And I think you made a very important closing remark there. We want to hear about the solutions and what's worked for you when we open up for discussion, as much as questions to the panel. But before I move on, Frank, reflecting on what Han said there, he reminded us that we're social beings, not machines, but we do like to congregate around machines. So I'm just wondering what opportunities that might create in terms of sort of enhancing or embedding digital learning into the wonderful classrooms that you showed us that you're building here in Edinburgh.
I think
Glasgow, sorry. Looking at Sian, sorry, Glasgow.
I think Edinburgh have got their own budget for that.
Yes.
First of all, I see the digital and the physical as a continuum. And I think it's important to see the physical and digital as a continuum, so that when you're looking, if you're looking at the design of a physical space, you really need to be thinking about how individuals or groups will interact with the digital, both in that and around it. And so for me, getting that broader environment right is absolutely crucial. Certainly the approach here has been to develop quite a variety of different types of space that are digitally enabled, that will allow individuals to work as individuals, but also groups to work as individuals. And groups to work as groups. But these groups could be groups of students, but equally it could be a faculty member and a group of students working in a small sort of tutorial environment. And I think the more you make that environment a comfortable environment for people to be in, the more they feel at home in that environment, the more that you'll get the coffee machine effect. And coffee is important. When we started to think about expansion of the campus, we looked at campuses all over the world. And two factors came out as the dominant two factors you had to get right. One was coffee, and the other was power. And you can add connectivity into that, but essentially, as underpinning factors that enable life on a campus, these are important. So when we think about teaching spaces or study spaces or learning spaces, we actually think about the entirety of what supports them, what's around them, and what people will do within them. And we generally try to encourage different disciplines to come into the same space. So the new learning and teaching building that I talked about earlier is a generic building for all students, for all staff. And that is to encourage that interaction.
Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought there, not least about maybe partly answering your question, Han. I'm going to take some questions from the board here, but I am going to throw it out for you to think about. So Han set a challenge. He's still muddling, I think. If you're muddling, that's a good thing. Muddling through the question about what kind of teaching and learning space should be the new building that you invest in. So any ideas or suggestions that you have in the audience, I'll take a couple of thoughts a bit later on. Perhaps I could start off with some of the questions that have come through on the board here. There's an interesting question here. I'm not sure we've really touched on this in detail. Active or open space learning seems very well fitted to non-lab disciplines. How can we adapt STEM teaching and learning practices and shift assumptions? So, relating what we've been talking about to the STEM situation and what assumptions are we making? Who would like to have a go at that first? Han?
Well, I think active and open space learning is actually also very good in laboratory-based disciplines. I'm from a laboratory-based discipline. What's quite interesting to see now, we have more and more students that need to do experiments in the laboratories. However, a lot of the experimentation can already be done online beforehand. So now, before they really go into the lab, wear their goggles and wear the hand gloves, they need to do that, they need to make it. But they can make a lot of mistakes by mingling wrong chemicals and see explosions on screen, which are very close to reality. And if you do that in a room where there is a lot of interaction, you can already create this type of environment also there. So I think using that type of digital possibilities also in laboratory-based teaching is very helpful.
Frank, I think you have something to add.
I would agree. I think it's important to remember that labs are active learning spaces to begin with. So labs are not always just about an individual student conducting an individual experiment. Quite often they are well, that's active for the individual student, but also they're quite often group laboratories. But actually, if I can reflect the experience of my own discipline, so my own background is in engineering, and a number of years ago, the UK engineering councils revised engineering degree programs to put design at the heart of the curriculum. The view was that design should begin at the earliest stages of the student's development all the way through to graduation. So now every engineering course in the UK has design embedded all the way through the curriculum. And actually the active or open spaces are ideal for this type of activity. And indeed some of the larger collaborative spaces that you see in campuses around the world are actually in engineering schools. A very good example of a new building at Texas A&M which is built on this entire principle.
Thank you. Sian, interesting question here about, in thinking about the University of Edinburgh's vision to support cross-disciplinary, co-created, creative, oh, they've moved the question now. I'm trying to read it out for you. Co-created, creative curriculum supporting lifelong learning. Is there, basically the question, is there a tension with the prevailing LMS, LLV course and context-centric model? Do you see any tension there?
Yeah, there is tension, but I wouldn't say it was particularly with the course and content models. I think people are very willing to experiment with those. It's more of the disciplinary models. When developing kind of cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary teaching is really hard. As I'm sure we're all aware, because academics identify very strongly with their disciplines, because in our university anyway, the schools are built around disciplines and money flows through schools. So everything kind of philosophically and pragmatically is converging on the discipline, sort of disciplinary entrenchment. So actually trying to design programs which tackle the kind of global challenges that I listed, but from across multiple schools, it is quite difficult. What we're hoping to do is to kind of, rather than ask schools to develop programs, to actually look at those themes and then design programs according to those themes. So mapping course offers or module offers to each of those themes in a much more flexible, organic way, and in that way to kind of work around the kind of tendency to always be pulled back into a monodisciplinary mode. But that's the challenge, I would say, not LMS VLE type centrism.
Thank you. There is a question here which is getting lots of thumbs up, so I think looking at the time, we must ask this one. It's a question for you, Frank. Basically, it says, love the new spaces, great. Can you say something about the pedagogical support that you're going to put into place to help the academic staff get confident and comfortable in these spaces if they are not early adopters?
Yes, now this is a great question, because this, of course, to some extent might be viewed as the $90 million question. It's how do you make this work? And we've played around a bit with this. We've had mixed success, but we've also been looking at what other institutions have been doing. And we've picked up a number of what you might call top tips from other institutions that have had particular successes. So one of them is McGill. McGill has used a technique where what we started to do, just to explain what we did, was as we developed the spaces, we advertised them to staff. We said, would you want to teach in a space like this? So we put an open offer out to all staff. And then once the staff signed up and said they did want to teach in the space, we actually provided training in the space ahead of teaching beginning. That didn't work too well. For some reason, faculty colleagues don't like the word training. And one of the things we picked up from McGill was, don't call it training, call it a meeting of all staff that are going to use this room, and people come along to it because people are used to coming to meetings. And it can turn into a development session. So what we're doing is we're building up a group of people. The question makes reference to the early adopters. Early adopters have that motivation to have problems. They have that motivation to hit the barriers, to get past the barriers, and to think their way through how to solve things, whereas others may be slightly more reluctant. What the early adopters allow us to do are to identify the barriers that we need to remove institutionally so that others will not hit them. But what they can also do is they can help with the development of colleagues that are coming along to use the spaces. So our intention is when the hub opens, we'll be offering a lot of meetings to staff. Those meetings will involve support from our learning enhancement and academic development service. It will involve staff that have already been using these spaces and using them over the past couple of years. But we will also be putting people into the rooms in the early weeks of teaching that are experienced with any of the tech that's in the room, so that if anything goes wrong with the tech, it gets fixed like that, rather than that becoming a reason not to use the room. So that's the kind of approach that we're taking.
Thanks very much, Frank. And that's really also about changing the culture. It's about tackling all of those points I think people have raised earlier. There's a great question that's just popped up here for the panel. And I think I'm looking to you, Lauren, here, and possibly Han, is is the ideal space, is it pedagogy-led or is it technology-led design? Okay, so that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, well, given the emphasis on health and well-being of both staff and students, is there consideration for sort of non-tech, back to basics teaching where possible? So two really interesting questions, but I think that first one, should it be pedagogy-led design or technology-led design? Would you like to kick us off, Lauren?
Well, I hate to be too much of an anthropologist and say it depends, but I'm going to say it depends. I think that if we're talking about developing an entirely new approach and starting from scratch, creating an innovative new opportunity for education, then perhaps technology will need to lead and constrain design. If we're talking about taking an extant university, an extant campus, an extant program, and design for future learning, it must be pedagogy-led. We start with the spaces that we have, the people that we have, the students that we have, and the programs that we have. And technology is going to continue to change. Pedagogy-led design allows us to create something sustainable.
Thank you. Han?
Well, and for the second half, how does technology help us for the well-being of staff and students, or going back to basic teaching? That question assumes that back to basic teaching is better for the well-being, and I'm sure that's not the case. And there is also a reality. I come from a medical background, and for 30 years, every year we had to do more for less money. That's in the whole healthcare system, and it's done. If you remember what happened to your appendicitis 30 years ago, and now you can see that change. And I think in education, we will have to do more for more students with less resources. And the only solution we can find is creative technology helping us. And if you do it well, it does help you. So I'm convinced that we need technology helping us also for the well-being of students and staff. But I see somebody is fiercely opposing me. Oh.
You have a question? Why don't you ask it? We've got 3 minutes.
Sorry to interrupt your flow with you've got a good relationship with the board there. But
it was new to me. I wasn't expecting it. So
I've got two questions. I'm the director of a small project in Wales called Black Mountains College, and we are hoping to be the UK's second new university in I think it's 40 years after Buckingham. And one of our philosophies is that the classroom should be the last resort as a site of learning. We've learned quite a lot from Quest University, where, as you may know, in Canada, they have no departments, no faculty, no research, and it's all about pedagogy, and we're hoping to implement some elements of that. So I just wondered, for Han, talking about the future and thinking about the classroom as a last resort, and secondly, as the concept of just not having any departments, and that's easy for a startup that doesn't have buildings yet to talk about, but for the established institutions, that's much more of a challenge. So I just wondered if that was something to think about.
Well, I would agree that the classical classroom, I think also shown by Frank already, the classical classroom with a teacher and rows of students, that is maybe not even a last resort anymore, it's no resort at all anymore. I think that's very few occasions that you have, like we are sitting here listening, and attentive people listening to us. It may work a little bit still, but in that sense it's true. But I'm convinced that having students together with teachers, that will remain a very important part. With all the digitation and kind of knowledge clips or web lectures, the combination of students and teacher, I'm very sure, will be key to any type of education.
Thank you. There's one last question here. Do we have a microphone? Yes, it's coming.
Thank you. Han, since you're from the medical background, about physical and digital, or physical or digital, as far as medicine is concerned, it has to be physical complemented by digital, or physical supported by digital. It can't be a replacement or something. Say, for example, newer innovative methods of medical education, like medical simulators coming in endoscopy or bronchoscopy, or even for that matter, cath lab simulators and simulators for general surgery. So these are different types and newer methods which are coming up. So it totally depends upon the discipline which we are talking about, and we can't have a generalized thing that one thing for everything. And as far as your area is concerned, it has to be physical plus digital together into the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I fully agree, but I think also for other disciplines that is the case.
Well, we have finished our time slot here. I hope you enjoyed those presentations and got some really good takeaways. I certainly have. Could we say another thanks to our panel, and please enjoy the rest of your conference.